Okay, in this presentation I'm going to try to keep it brief so that we can save time for input from you all. If you missed the conversation today, I will provide a link to the Google form so you can watch this presentation and answer those questions and still get credit. So today I'm going to be just briefly introducing the idea that law and change can be examined by three different points of view: individual, social, and structural. I'm hoping that you'll see that not as three choices, but as three levels. So if you're kind of just thinking about law and social change for the first time, you might think about it on the individual level. If you've been thinking about this for a while or you've experienced injustice, you're probably interested in thinking about it on the social level or examining power relationships. And then, if you're going through this class, my goal is that you will be able to start to see how to analyze law and change at the structural level. A phrase that you might be hearing is systemic racism, and there are similarities to structural analysis. However, the difference might be when I hear the phrase systemic racism, it's used differently by different folks. So sometimes they're talking about systems of overt racism, say like the KKK, and then sometimes they're talking about systems as in economic systems, redlining, and other practices in banking, and then sometimes they're talking about systems as in the criminal justice system, so in policing and corrections. Structural, on the other hand, would be looking at the history and what is called the genealogy that has led up to those norms that created those systems in the first place. So it's taking a kind of a multi-systems perspective. And in that sense, you'd want to use this idea of changes over time. And you'd want to look at just some specific things. So you might take all three of those things that I mentioned and then measure them over time, say 500 years in three different countries, but then pull out specific examples. And so that would be kind of the difference that we'd be looking at towards the end of the semester. One idea, however, I want to pull out here is this phrase defund. And I just want to point out that in just these brief examples here, these are all from the right wing of the Republican Party. Examples of using the phrase defund. So defund education, defund the states, and defund Planned Parenthood. So this has been a phrase that's been used for at least 45 to 50 years within the Republican Party, and then in some ways before that, although this is in some ways a reaction to the Great Depression and the policies that came out of that. So I want to come back to that idea because what we want to start thinking about today is how does knowledge and power come into relationship. So oftentimes you'll hear the phrase knowledge is power, but that makes it sound like they're separate things and you bring them together. So they're not separate, but they are separated. In other words, they don't come separate. And if you look at this Venn diagram here, nature, discourse, and politics are not quote-unquote naturally separated. In other words, I can't go out into a field and look for nature, politics, and discourse. They're phrases that we have separated, particularly in the West, through academic language, and now more and more in the mainstream. So by whom? Who's doing this separating? I'll go out on a limb here and say that by and large it's elite white males. So if we're talking about discourse on the political level, the presidential election is pretty obvious, right? You have two old white males, both with wealthy backgrounds, arguing about which one has done more illegal activities in economics. So then we think about our politics, and so who separates the politics? Well, what is the real difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party when compared to, say, a third party in Europe or in South Africa, or if we look at kind of international human rights, like struggles that are in Brazil or Bolivia, what is the difference then between the Republican and Democratic Party in the United States? Not much. And so otherwise, the politics are also controlled by elite white men and giving you very two small differences. Now, they have big effects in America, but when we take a larger look, they've been separated from even those other countries. So then we get to this question of nature, and so what do we mean separated? Again, this is an elite white man named Descartes who separated the concept that we are somehow separate from nature. And even in this concept of the Anthropocene, if you're saying this in the news, you're seeing that this is giving the illusion that we are separated. And again, that's old white men, largely that benefit from the fossil fuels industry. So, you see knowledge as being used by people in power. And so this is kind of how we start to reconstruct the networks of information. In other words, if we look at how knowledge of power is kind of traveling within elite circles, we might get a better idea of what are some other countercultural circles, resistance circles, and then probably the largest group of people who are just trying to figure out what's going on. So then we see that power as a concept kind of is in the middle of three integrated ideas. What would be called scientific facts, right? Trying to figure out what's true, what's not, what's fake news, what's good information. Social relations, so how we get along with each other, what we call society, what is a social norm, kind of all these big questions that you're probably looking at in other classes. And then what is law, right? Is law simply a prohibition, you shall not do something, or is it also a form of resistance? Do you need those two things to go together? In other words, I say, no, you can't, you say, yes, I can. And so then we start to look at it in a much larger context. Well, there must be more going on than what we've previously thought. So again, we don't want to separate facts, law, and social. We want to bring them together and see what is the power of having knowledge about these three areas when we start looking at the interrelationship. So then we also want to do the same thing for the idea of community. So community obviously includes individuals, but it also constructs individuals, right? So you are not a son unless you have a mother and father, right? And if your mother and father have passed or they're no longer in your life, you were still constituted by the fact that you were born. The same kind of idea goes with structure, right? You can't really have a physical place of community unless there's a community center. And that could be your home, that could be a healthcare facility, that could be a governmental office, that could be an after-school program, it could be an elementary school, right? It could be anything. But again, there must be some structure. There must be something that has been created that goes beyond the individual, that brings a sense of community. And then that gets us to role relations, right? There's a teacher-student. There's a healthcare worker, patient, right? So in each of these situations, we see power is being exercised through community, through our social relations. So now we want to look at a couple of examples. And these are two people I've heard from, and I've just changed their names. So M is a single mother of a small boy and works part-time as an administrative assistant. She said, "I am afraid for my child because he has darker skin." So if we apply what we've learned so far, M believes she is a part of a targeted group. Those members must make limited choices based on the will of more powerful folks. And I think this is a common understanding from folks I've talked to. M's role power includes the fact that she's a mother, so she has the power of family. She's a worker, so she has the power of labor. And she's a member of a targeted group, so she has the power of resistance. However, media, entertainment, and politics reinforce her views of this situation. So it would be difficult to introduce a new sense of power or a new idea of power, but for, say, education, like higher education as you're going through now today. But this is going to be complicated because of this kind of concept here. And I borrowed this from Stuart Parker's sociology class. So this is a role power diagram. So if you see the roles, parent and child, they have the shared mental model of being in a family. A family, again, is not something I can go out into a field and find. It's not a rock, it's not a plant, it's not a tree. It's a social construct that we have made in order to understand our place in the world, if you will, a little bit better. So how does this kind of reinforce, right? How is this idea reinforced through the parent-child relationship? Well, if you start with I'll start with the above situation. So if you go from left and then up to around. So the parent has the ability to make the rules. And again, this is not a should argument. I'm not saying that they should be able to do this, but by and large, this is what happens. So this creates this idea of status, security, of belonging. In other words, the parent will say, I'm not, establishing this rule to punish you. I'm not establishing this rule to be mean to you. I'm doing this to keep you safe. And then, this will lead to something like child abuse laws and parenting norms. In other words, the more people who practice this process, make a rule that creates this idea that we're safe or that we have a sense of belonging, the more that this occurs, then society, right, social groups will create things like child abuse laws. We agree that this thing is okay, this thing is not okay. And then this gets through parenting norms, again, through media, through politics, and through entertainment. You'll start to see, okay, this is what is expected. And so, on the other hand, if we see it from the child's perspective, we'll go from the right to the left. So, the right to the left is interesting, right? Because the child, the quote unquote child who respects their elders or their parents, right, will participate in this rule system. They'll think that this is beneficial to them, and they'll do this because, of course, they want to continue living there, and they want the protection of the parent. However, this also, means that the child starts to understand that there's freedom or there's autonomy within this set of rules, within this limited set of choices. So if we go back to M's idea, she's a mother, so she participates in this system. And then what she's saying is she's internalized this childlike mentality that within the larger system, because she's targeted, okay, so because she's participating in the system and yet not getting the benefit, she's not getting protection, she sees her freedom or her autonomy as limited within a set of choices. So now we want to think about why that is. Well, let's contrast her situation to another's. So K is a white male police officer of 15 years. He says no one believes in personal responsibility anymore. K believes that he is an individual who makes choices based on his free will. His role power includes the fact that he's a police officer, he has the power of violence, he's a homeowner, so he has the power of security, and he's a member of society, so he's a power of exclusive community. In other words, his society. And then again, media, entertainment, and politics reinforce his views. So now let's overlay his experience as a police officer with that of M as a mother, and you'll see the exact same situation, only there's an interesting relationship between obey and the norms. So if we start off with security again, and then we go through the same process that we just went through with the parent, we'll see that the police enforce the laws. That's very similar to the ability to make the rules. Now, what do they get for doing that? They get pay, they get status, and they get respect. So then it goes down to the norms, right? So we have the expectation that citizens, just like children, will follow the rules, will give the police respect, and will follow these quote-unquote generalized norms that society has manufactured. On the other hand, if we look at it from the point of view of the citizen's job, the good citizen's job, just like the good child's job, is to obey the norms. This will lead to safety, and that safety will produce, again, a limited set of freedom and autonomy in order to maintain security. And this is something I hear from students all the time. But think very carefully. In the sense of Black Lives Matter, and in the sense of defund the police, what people are saying is just like the mother said, right? I'm not getting that sense of security. I'm not getting that protection. In fact, I'm being targeted. So so she's right? If you look at the diagram, what are the choices? The choices are to obey the norms. So if obey the norms means to continue to be targeted, to continue to be punished, right, for following the norms, then what would be the incentive to keep doing this? And so this is why you see, or this is one reason why you see folks engaging in civil disobedience, even when there's consequences like getting arrested, having a criminal record that will affect your economic employment, and possibly get you kicked out of school. This is kind of, people are trying to break out of this diagram, break out of this cycle. So this brings me to the final two slides. We have to understand that we're not on the same bus. And I've heard several kind of folks say this ideal, and wouldn't it be lovely, right? That folks without power would drive the bus. They would now be in charge of the bus, and the bus being society. And that folks with power would get out and push the bus for the first time, right? They'd be giving the labor and supporting those in power. The problem is that we are not in the same bus, and this was the mistake from the beginning. We might want to construct the same bus and travel on the same bus, but that has not been the historic or genealogical structural position of relations within the United States. So the reality is that there are folks without power are walking. They're not in the bus. And if they're in a bus, then they're being bused to a very particular location. You might also think of it as like one of those automated cars, right? So the bus is taking them somewhere, but it was designed to take them to a very particular place. So you might have the illusion of driving that bus, but the bus has already been predetermined to go to a very particular course of action. On the other hand, folks without power are driving faster and faster away. So, the bus is even an interesting metaphor, and so I had to think about it for several weeks, and I came to this idea is that, busing is a product of trying to quote unquote end school segregation, but it didn't work. And I think now, if you think about it in this way, is like, who are taking buses, right? So this image, I think, captures it. This is from just a couple years ago, versus elite white kids who are being chauffeured, right? They're being driven to school, oftentimes private schools of all other white kids, or the schools are in the traditional sense, right down the street from their house, and so they're not taking the bus at all. They're taking a brand new Mercedes, and so the interruption that's occurring between this ideal and the real experience is Black Lives Matter and the Defund the Police movement, with the goal of legislative and legal change. So again, still seeing it within the same system, and that might be a problematic theory, but we'll think about it over time. So we want to kind of end this with these questions, and this is what I'm looking to get from you. So where does power lie? Is it in the individual? Is it in the structure? Is it in the role relations? Is it in all three? And what does this kind of say about community? So we want to think about what would change look like, and what are the rules of social relations, and how would information about these rules get exchanged equitably within networks and across networks? And so I'll turn it over to you at this point.